Good, good. I want to start here by getting an idea of who's in the audience. So if you currently work on an Agile team or in an Agile organization, can you raise your hand, please? Thanks. And now if you actually use Scrum, can you raise your hand? Okay, and now is there anybody here from the world of construction? Two. Okay. Well, I'm going to start here, which is, have you ever worked on a team where you had unclear priorities, there were silos, unclear roles, lack of visible progress on what's important and why, lack of accountability? Does any of this sound familiar at all? If it does, you've probably worked on projects, no matter whether they're in IT, whether they're in construction. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Specifically, we're going to be discussing my experience over the last 5 or 6 years working with an energy company in Canada using Scrum to build natural gas processing plants. So I'll give you a little bit of background, and then we'll talk about the first project, or the first plant that we built, and then we'll quickly go into a program of plants that we built, 3 of them. They're usually in the $800 million size, so the last program that we worked on was about $2.5 billion. We're going to talk about what the differences were when we started to have to work with multiple organizations in order to accomplish this. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, what we learned and what I think the next steps are in applying Scrum to these projects. So a little bit of background. What's a gas plant? Well, it processes natural gas. What it does is it takes feedstock from the surrounding area and it removes water, sand, sulfur, other hydrocarbons. And it processes in this case, about 400 million cubic feet per day. How much is that? This is the Titanic. That's Boeing A360. So this is the volume about 5 times every hour. So I just wanted to give you an idea of the size of the machinery that we're dealing with here. Where is this? It's in Canada, British Columbia, in the north. It's a lot colder there than it is here in the winter. Very often, for projects like this, the only way in and out of these large projects, which is up to 700 and 800 people, is by helicopter. So there are some physical constraints on this work. Engineering, procurement, and construction projects, what are they? Well, engineering, the deliverable is really the drawings and the design that are needed for the procurement of equipment and materials so that we can do construction. What's procurement? It's taking those deliverables from engineering, getting purchase orders, contracts in place, so that again, we can get materials and people at site when we need them. And then of course, the deliverable for construction is a working natural gas processing plant that's built safely. Now, these activities happen in overlapping style. So what we normally see is we try to do just enough of the engineering to get the procurement going so that we can start construction as early as possible. So change. One of the things that that drew me to this work, because most of my work has been with software clients, is that now we're talking about trying to apply some of these techniques in worlds where it seems like change isn't very practical. Software, change a line of code, you get instant feedback, and you can change. How does that work when you're actually building physical objects? It turns out that the construction part of these projects is the least risky part of these projects. We've been building things for a very, very, very long time. If we can get materials and people to site when we need them, we will be successful. The tricky part, as it turns out, is the cost of delay that these projects normally accrue, because things don't get engineered on time, so that we can't purchase things on time, so they don't arrive on time. So a lot of what we're dealing with here is how to deal with the cost of delay in these projects. One of the things that I found interesting about this work as opposed to software is these companies and this kind of work, they know exactly what their return on investment is. They know exactly how much it's going to cost per day to deliver this, and they know what their revenue stream is going to be once they complete the project. We don't know that on software projects. We don't do a very good job of that. That is not the case here. So the reason why that's important is people in this industry absolutely understand the real cost of delay, and it's often millions of dollars a day. So once again, this work came about because the sponsor and director of the program and projects, he and I had known each other not professionally, socially, and for a number of weeks and months, he would talk to me about these problems. He would talk to me about the problems he was having with his teams trying to build these plants. And of course, me being in the software world, I was saying, well, those all sound like very familiar problems to me. They occur on software development projects. And we solve those using Scrum, the 3 pillars of Scrum: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. So, after a number of months, the project sponsor decided to start an experiment. We started an experiment where we were going to start to apply Scrum to the construction of natural gas plants. So that's what we're going to talk about this afternoon. So we'll start with this. Values. Courage, focus, commitment, respect, openness. I'm going to give you a few examples of how it's important that a team, no matter what domain they're working on, embody these values. Seem to have a font issue here. Let's start with this, focus. Stack ranking and prioritization of issues. Don't worry about what this says. I just want you to understand that what we did on this project was constantly make sure that the teams had backlogs of issues that were prioritized by a product owner that we knew if we worked on and solved, we were going to move this project forward. Very, very similar to what we do in Scrum. Courage. For me, it's probably the most important value for a Scrum team, because if you don't have the courage to do all these things, to speak up and change the way you work, it's going to be very difficult to be successful. So in this case, yes, we had regular feedback loops, not only on what we were working on, but how we were working on it. So we would hold retrospectives on a regular basis. We would come up with retrospective actions. And look at this. It's not very high tech, is it? It's a poster on a wall. For the first project, we had the luxury of having everybody who was involved, or at least all of management who was involved, all co-located, which means we didn't have to rely on technology to communicate. We had a dedicated Scrum room where these sorts of messages, these sorts of commitments to each other were up on the wall for us to see at all times. You have to be open. This is a picture of the planning board. You're probably familiar with it. Here's your stories. What have you got to do? What's in progress? What's done? There's even a burn down chart there. Again, this was information radiators to make sure that a multidisciplined group of people had the information that they needed to minimize cost of delay. Working agreements, yeah, really important. As we'll see in a minute, especially if you have multiple organizations involved, multiple organizations generally have different cultures. They have different ways of meeting. They have different ways of communicating and talking. When you have to start to rely on each other, you have to figure out what's going to work for this particular team that's made up of multiple cultures. So it's important to have that discussion and come to agreement on how we're going to work. And here's an example of sprint goals. Again, up on the wall, we had to issue front-end engineering design, project plan, define the project management team, roles and responsibilities, and a number of other items while meeting the level 2 milestones that were in the schedule. Again, this is an information radiator that is designed to make sure that everybody who's involved in this work understands what's most important at the project level, not at the individual discipline level. This is what's important at the project level to move forward. Okay, so that's the values. Now what about the Scrum roles? This is maybe where something's a little bit different. The product owner, what do? They figure out what's valuable. They figure out what problems are we actually trying to solve so that a talented multidisciplinary team can actually solve those problems. In this case, in these types of projects, that person is actually usually has the title project manager. So we didn't have to make a change there. We had a project manager. But as far as a Scrum Master goes, that didn't exist in this organization. So we had to create a new role, which we call a team facilitator. And you all understand what a Scrum Master does. This organization needed to have some training and some coaching on the fulfillment of this particular role, because it's very important. You have someone who actually understands Scrum, who can help remove impediments with the team, and can help keep them on in the right path and the right framework. And then, of course, there's the multidisciplinary specialists that form the team. Okay, so nothing new there, really. Presumably, you've seen all that before. Now, the Scrum artifacts themselves, product backlog, sprint backlog, product increment. As I mentioned earlier, we had all of that. We used the same principles. We'd have a project issue backlog, and we were constantly asking our product owner to prioritize it, and the team would then have a planning session, figure out what the tasks were, and every 2 weeks we would either have solved the problem or we would have had to figure out a new solution. I'm showing you this little mind map here because this is where the project backlog started. We used a mind map, we put a question in the middle, and in this case, it was how do we know that we've effectively learned the lessons from the previous plant? This is the team writing all over this poster saying, here are the things that are missing, here are the things that we need to work on, here are the things that we think are currently solved. That formed a basis for us to build a backlog. And then, of course, we had the sprint backlogs. Every couple of weeks, we take the highest priority items and have the team work on them. Again, not much new. This part is probably a little new. In software, the product increment is working tested functionality. Now, as I said earlier, in these types of projects, the real risk is in everything leading up to the construction. In software, the risk is that we're building the wrong thing. So we need to be able to course correct. So in this case, our product increment was, what do we have to make sure is in place, whether it's engineering design drawings, procurement activities, POs, purchase orders, contracts. What do we need to have in place to make sure that we are going to have people, materials, and equipment on site when we need them? So our product increment was both the deliverables as well as the 3D modeling that takes place with the engineering design. We would do constructability reviews every month to make sure that the design that we had put together was going to be constructible. So that was our product increment. The Scrum events themselves, you're all familiar with them. I'll just briefly give you an idea of what we actually shifted around the traditional way of managing these projects. Normally, there's a monthly update to an integrated schedule that occurs. That informs a 12-week look ahead, that informs a 3-week look ahead. And then there's a review of that 3-week look ahead, and around we go. What we did was we injected essentially Scrum at the bottom of this picture. So along with the 3-week look ahead, we put together a 2-week sprint plan, iteration plan, that didn't just include what was on the schedule, but included things like what came out of our retrospectives, what are our actual project priorities, and what information are we getting from the KPIs and our goals that we need to achieve. We would then put that in the sprint backlog, work those issues, and every 2 weeks, repeat this process. Again, iteration planning looks pretty standard, right? You've got the things that we need to accomplish, the tasks that need to be done, and the state of them. Are they in progress or are they done? We did daily stand-ups to talk about the progress, talk about impediments, and talk about the things that needed to change as we learned, not only daily, but from iteration to iteration. One of the things you'll see down here, again, list of impediments. Every single day, new impediments come up. It was important for us to track, are those impediments still open? Who owns trying to figure out how to help the team get past them? The daily Scrum, what is it? It's really a conversation that this team has about how do we make the best use of our day to reach our goals, and what's getting in the way. So as long as we are having that conversation and we all understand what's important, we have a much better shot of actually getting to the bottom of the issues and dealing with them. Look at this, a Gantt chart in a Agile conference. Who would have thought that? The reason I'm showing you this is because this Gantt chart was actually the way that on a regular basis we would be able to talk about what we accomplished, because what happens in this world is it's very schedule based, and what we're looking at on a month by month basis is what did we actually accomplish according to this plan. So it was one of the ways that the team was able to actually try to figure out what have we actually accomplished. Also, and probably more importantly, not only what have we accomplished, but what did we learn and how does this plan need to change? Iteration retrospectives. Again, we had that conversation. What went well? What are you glad about? What should we keep doing? What should we stop doing? What should we start doing? We had that conversation. How should we actually, as a team, improve how we're actually working together? We took those actions. Some of them involved work that the multidisciplinary team had to do that doesn't show up on the Gantt chart. Okay, so in this first case, have you ever been on a project where it's on time, it's on time, it's on time, until the day before, and suddenly it's a month late? Okay, what we were trying to make sure that we understood was at any given time, we want to know if things aren't going the way we wanted them to go. So we were asking the teams to make sure they understood what their goals were, plan out their activities, track those activities on a daily and biweekly basis so that we had as much time as possible to deal with the things that always come up, the things that don't go the way you want them to go. We did, in fact, in this case, end up transferring these techniques to the site for what's called turnover, which is construction actually turning the plant over to operations. The project sponsor believes this approach changed the cycle time by a factor of 3 on dealing with all of the issues that usually come up. Things that were taking 6 weeks to deal with before we started using this process were now starting to take 2 weeks or less to deal with. We reduced the overall project cycle time by 5 to 10%, and in this case, we didn't actually get to see the end result of our work because the plant got sold before it was finished construction. I'm going to give you better results for this next program that we're going to talk about here. I think the big thing that came out of that was that the people who were funding this work and the project sponsor recognized that this new way of looking at how to do a fairly traditional project was actually paying dividends. So they decided to continue that same approach on 3 new gas plants. Again, involving about 700 to 800 people, $2.5 billion. It again is in Canada, British Columbia, but it was a little bit different in terms of its complexity for 3 different reasons. One was, on the first plant, we were doing all the execution. The energy company was actually doing the work. In this case, that had been now contracted to an EPCM contractor, and we, as the owners, were now looking at oversight instead of just execution. So that complicated things. We were using design one, build many. That sounds like a concept out of software. I personally was amazed that this seemed to be such a new concept in this world, but it is. And then, of course, we had many, many concurrent activities because these 3 particular plants were only slightly staggered. So we had engineering, procurement, and construction activities going on at the same time for all 3 of these plants. Okay, so I'm going to refer back to what I was speaking about earlier, which was one of the issues that comes up when you enter into an arrangement like we did with an EPCM contractor is now you have an owner who has a way of doing things and a culture, and you have an EPCM contractor who probably doesn't have the same culture. They've been doing things the same way for a very long time. And we use this competing values framework to actually look at how do the cultures of these 2 organizations differ, because we knew that we were going to have to figure out how to speak about and how to act upon a common way of doing things. So we did some analysis, and I'm just showing you a brief little picture here that effectively shows that the EPCM contractor was much, much more heavily interested in control than the actual owner was here. That's the biggest difference that you see here. So when we spotted that, we understood that something needs to shift around how we're going to work together. So has anyone here read anything by Patrick Lencioni at all? Anyone? Yeah, a couple of you have. What we tried to do was we tried to actually figure out what is it that we can take from both of these cultures, how we communicate, and figure out how we can articulate and then act upon those things for this particular team, okay? I think one of the mistakes that we made was that we tried to actually use exactly the same approach that we did on the first plant when we were actually executing it. We tried to use exactly the same approach and realized that because we're in oversight mode, that was not going to work. Where we landed was we were trying to use Scrum in an oversight mode, but the EPCM contractor was still in an older world. What we had to do is we had to help the EPCM contractor start to understand the use of Scrum, which in the end they did. How do we approach communication? We used Scrum of Scrums. Are you familiar with this, Scrum of Scrums? What that meant was we had 3 different plants in construction at the same time, each with their own teams. They were going to run across problems, some of which that were specific to their plants, some of which were common to all of the plants. We used a Scrum approach to have representatives from those teams talk together every day to make sure that we could learn from each other. Because they were staggered, it meant that when we would find a problem for one team, we may not be able to apply that lesson to the other teams immediately, but we would be able to give them a heads up, a notification that this is coming, and when you get to that phase of your plant, you're going to be dealing with the same problem, and they've already figured out a way to get around it. We use something called the 24-hour rule, and that was when you come across a problem, you've got 24 hours to sort that problem out on your own. If you can't sort that problem out on your own, get more people involved. Bring it to your team. Don't let these things fester. Bring it up at your stand-up so that we can get more and more people involved in figuring out how to solve them. We also discovered, of course, that when you involve multiple teams, multiple companies, you start to live in the world of distributed teams. So we were using Excel, screen sharing, telephones. It worked. It does work. But it's still not as good as being co-located in the same room, right? This is exactly what we find in software development projects. As far as the actual work product itself, of course, one of the things from Agile is just enough. So in this case, when we were doing 3D model reviews, one of the things that changed in this world was that rather than waiting for the entire model to be built before it was reviewed, we would have just enough of the model to satisfy a particular part of construction so that we could do a constructability review on an iterative basis rather than a big bang basis, which was the norm at the time. We also used what we called a breakdown breakthrough model. And what is that? Well, essentially, it's when you look at that schedule that seems to dominate these types of projects. Very often, people can look at the schedule and say, there's no way that that thing there that's supposed to happen on December 1st is going to happen. There's no way it's going to happen. We wanted the team to embrace that. We wanted people to say, don't be afraid to say that can't happen. Because that's what we used as a big part of our backlog of issues. We wanted to know when people thought there's no way we can meet that deadline. Great. Let's get it at the top of the backlog and let's get the team to figure out what are the processes that are currently broken, what are the handoffs that are having, what are all the costs of delay that are involved in the reason why you think that can't happen. That was a very, very important part of getting this work done on time and in fact ahead of time. And what does it mean? It really means that the team was not afraid to challenge the status quo. Again, these people have been doing this work for decades in a particular way. We were asking them to say, please challenge the status quo. Please ask to do something differently. Don't just say we can't do that. Let's have a conversation about what could we do differently to get us closer to our accomplishments. This came out of a team survey that we did that I thought was quite relevant. The result of applying Agile and Breakdown is the realization that challenging the status quo and using nonlinear thinking is required for success. And this does not show up on a Gantt chart. So to me, this is a very, very interesting comment from one of the team members because it tells me that they understand that this really isn't just about, is that 5? Okay. This really isn't just about, let's manage this with a schedule. You can't do that. We in the software world all know that. They're still trying to manage by schedule alone in the construction industry. This quote tells me that people are starting to understand that that's not possible, that there are other ways to do that. So I want you to have a quick look at this. This just came out 2 weeks ago. What you're seeing here is cost overrun and schedule overrun on projects that are in the billion-dollar range. The industry doesn't have a very good track record, as you can see. we're looking here on cost overrun, average 37%, schedule overruns about 53%. For oil and gas upstream and midstream, you know, it's about 30% cost overrun and somewhere around 50% schedule overrun. That's the industry norm, okay? The first gas plant of the three started producing revenue, gas to sales, 38 days early and was under budget. The second gas plant, 86 days early and under budget. The plant 3, which is not scheduled to come online for the next, I think, 30 days, reached its mechanical completion 119 days early. Now, mechanical completion simply means all the work's been done. Now we have to make sure that things are safe to start operations. So that last plant is still looking like it's going to be early and under budget. What's happened here is that collectively those three plants are about 10% under the estimated budget. So I want you to compare that to what the industry average has been here. It's a significant change. And of course, consequently, the people that have been funding this work want to continue to fund this work because every single day that those gas plants come on early, revenue starts early, right? There's a huge ROI change. So the future based on this, there's a few things that I thought might be worthwhile mentioning here. Now, Dave this morning mentioned that he doesn't really like this term mindset. I quite like this term mindset. Whether you call it attitude or mindset, this is about some work that Carol Dweck did back in about 10 years ago, talking about the difference between a static and growth mindset. The static mindset believes things like you are innately talented. The growth mindset says with hard work, perseverance, repetition, you can improve what you're doing. The static mindset says when we have challenges, we'll just accept them. The growth mindset says let's figure out how to get past those challenges. The key here for me is, and Dave mentioned this about tools, if you don't have the right mindset when you're using any tool and you don't understand how to best use that tool for the work that needs to be done, you're not going to improve. Unless you have a mindset which is, I need to figure these things out. I need to practice. I need to improve. That's what we wanted to instill in these teams was, I know you've been doing this work for 10 years in a particular way, but we believe that we can do better. And it was really important that the team actually understood that, yes, let's figure out how to do better rather than just continuing down the stream of becoming one of those statistics that is the average, which is over budget and over schedule. So a couple of things. One of the things that drove me crazy was our ability to get up-to-date information on where we are with this project. Normally what happens on these projects is the information gets updated every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks, but by the time it's actually in someone's hands, it's now out of date by at least 2 or 4 weeks. So when you look at what the status is supposed to be, you're looking at a status that was generated 2 or 4 weeks ago. Not very helpful, not very helpful at all. We're much better at that in software. There's still a long ways to go here in the construction industry. Using a floating and fluctuating end date for these projects. I think we still have some work there. And what I mean by that is because these projects are still so schedule driven, companies are very, very reluctant to actually have a floating end date because they have made some commitment that says we're going to be online by this date. So we're not going to let that date float. The problem with that, of course, is that when change happens and when things don't go the way you want them to go, it's much more difficult to see what the impact of that change is. If we unhooked that end date and let it float, it'd be much easier for people to see what the impacts of the things that were changing around them all the time was having on what we cared about, an end date. So I'll leave you with a few things here. This is the difference between a leader and a manager. Leaders help people understand that we can always look to do things differently and better. Managers, if you're just a manager, then you're managing what's happening right now. You're not looking necessarily forward, and you're not looking to improve upon what you and your teams can do. And if you're not familiar with this, I do urge you to go to that website, pmdoi.org. One of the previous speakers had a picture of Jim Highsmith, and he was one of the people that came up with this. Effectively, some of the signatories of the Agile Manifesto got together because they recognized that the same principles that apply in software absolutely apply to project management regardless of the domain, whether it's software or not. And I think you'll find that the types of things here, we increase return on investment by making continuous flow of value our focus. That applies everywhere. It doesn't apply just to software. So I would encourage you to go look at that because it's essentially it's an articulation of the approach that we took here. So, in closing, Scrum works outside of software. It's about feedback loops. It's about iteratively inspecting what you're working on and how you're working on it. But it can be applied outside of software. But I also believe that the success of it, just like the success of it in the software world, depends heavily on the people involved, modeling the specific values, and a growth mindset. Thank you. If anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to take some questions, but I will be around all day if you want to come and find me as well. Thanks very much.